What happens when a 27-year-old press secretary refuses to play the media's game and instead takes Hollywood to court and wins? This isn't just a defamation case, it's the story of a silent stand that turned into a national reckoning. Veterans rose. America watched. And in a moment of quiet strength, history changed, not with noise, but with truth. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Hit that subscribe button to follow more powerful stories like Karoline's. Comment below. Do you believe silence can still be strength in today's world? And share this video with someone who still believes in honor, dignity, and the courage to stand quietly but firmly. What happens when a Hollywood legend mocks America's fallen heroes, and a 27-year-old conservative woman dares to fight back? This isn't a movie. It's a real courtroom showdown that shook the nation. Karoline Leavitt didn't scream. She didn't post online. She gathered the evidence and took Robert Niro straight to federal court. What he said on stage may have cost him $150 million and the respect of an entire country. You won't believe what the cameras caught, what the emails revealed, and how one young patriot made history. Stay with us because this story changes everything. It happened at the Liberty Arts Gala in Los Angeles, an evening meant to celebrate creative voices, not insult the soul of a nation. Yet, when Robert Niro, the revered Hollywood actor turned political firebrand, took the stage, no one could have predicted that 10 seconds of arrogance would ignite a firestorm coast to coast. With a glass of champagne in one hand and a smirk on his face, he leaned into the microphone and declared to a laughing elite crowd, "These war memorials, these statues, they're nothing but violence worship. And girls like Karoline Leavitt, waving flags in front of cameras like they understand sacrifice. Please." The reaction wasn't delayed. It detonated. The clip hit social media before he stepped off stage. Veterans groups lit up the phones. Gold Star families expressed outrage. Fox News ran the quote on loop. Within an hour, thousands of Americans had heard it, and many were furious. The phrase "girls like Karoline Leavitt" didn't just sound condescending. It felt like a slap in the face to everyone who'd folded a flag over a loved one's casket. By sunrise, the internet had split in two. On one side, Hollywood voices defended Niro's comments as performance art, claiming he was questioning war culture. On the other, middle America roared. Veterans called in to radio shows. Church leaders issued statements. A retired Marine from Ohio said, "My brothers didn't die for some actor to mock their names from a stage." In South Carolina, a grieving mother whose son fell in Afghanistan wrote on Facebook, "War memorials are not props. Their memory carved in stone. We don't need Robert Niro to lecture us on sacrifice." And at the center of it all, Karoline Leavitt. The 27-year-old White House press secretary didn't post a rebuttal. She didn't go live on Instagram. She didn't demand an apology. In fact, she said nothing at all. Her silence was louder than any soundbite. While pundits speculated, mocked, defended, and twisted her name into headlines, Karoline disappeared from the conversation, but not from the narrative. Her restraint baffled some frustrated others and quietly inspired many. But make no mistake, the silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. In living rooms across America, people asked, "Why won't she say anything?" But veterans noticed something different. "That girl's not scared," said one VFW member in Pennsylvania. "She's thinking." And they were right. Because while cable news screamed for attention, Karoline was gathering something far more powerful than applause. She was gathering resolve. The media frenzy deepened. Niro, emboldened by applause from his inner circle, went further in a follow-up podcast. "The fact that people are upset proves my point. Patriotism's become a costume." That pushed things over the edge. Patriotic Americans, many who had never heard of Karoline before, now saw her as a symbol, a lightning rod, a woman whose silence meant strength, not submission. In Montana, a veteran carved her name into a wooden bench outside his American Legion post. In Alabama, an 82-year-old woman sent her a handwritten letter with a newspaper clipping of her grandson's name from the Vietnam Memorial. "He died at 19, the note read. "Thank you for not playing into their noise." And still Karoline said nothing. The divide across the nation grew louder. Hashtags erupted. #Stand with Karoline. #Niro. Disgrace. Memorials matter. Debates flooded morning shows. Columnists took sides. But something felt different this time. Older Americans, those who'd lived through war, who'd seen friends come home in flag-draped coffins, were watching closely. They weren't looking for outrage. They were waiting for something deeper. A response rooted in truth, not emotion. And deep down, they knew it was coming. What began as an arrogant jab at a war memorial had turned into a cultural reckoning. Not just about words or politics, but about honor history, and who gets to speak for the American sacrifice. And Karoline Leavitt, the so-called flag-waving girl, was no longer just a press secretary. She was becoming something more, a quiet defender of memory, standing alone against a spotlight she never asked for. In coffee shops from Kansas to Kentucky, the question echoed: would she let it go? Or would she fight back not with anger but with justice? The answer would come soon. And when it did, it wouldn't be with a tweet. It would be with a subpoena. The media waited. Pundits waited. Hollywood waited. They wanted the outburst, the viral meltdown, the angry young press secretary lashing back at a powerful actor. But Karoline Leavitt gave them none of it. No press conference, no Instagram video, no angry statement on Fox News. Just one sentence posted to her official account, 12 words that dropped like a stone into the middle of the political ocean. Loyalty doesn't need to shout. It proves itself through action. No hashtags, no emojis, no fanfare. Just that. At first, critics laughed. She's hiding, they said. She knows she can't match Niro's platform. But the people paying closer attention, veterans, military families, Americans raised to believe that silence sometimes signals strength, noticed something deeper. Karoline wasn't retreating. She was calculating, behind closed doors. While the online storm howled and commentators filled hours with recycled outrage, Karoline was already moving. In a quiet office inside the West Wing under soft fluorescent light, she sat down with her chief of staff and made a decision. This wasn't going to be a PR battle. It was going to be a legal one. And to fight it, she called a name known only to those who understood Washington's undercurrents. Sylvia Martinez, a constitutional attorney who'd worked for Trump during his hardest years, known for turning lawsuits into sledgehammers. Martinez didn't arrive with cameras. She came in through the side entrance, a dark suit, a leather folder, and no patience for distractions. She sat across from Karoline, listened to the story without interrupting, then asked one question: "Do you want to win or make a point?" Karoline's answer came fast: "Both." But in that order. Thus began what the press would later call the quietest legal storm in modern political memory. Karoline didn't want interviews. She wanted records. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted evidence. While the world thought she was silent, she was assigning aides to pull transcripts, timestamps, and internal data. Martinez built a timeline of Niro's remarks, not just from the gala, but every follow-up podcast, talk show, and social post where he doubled down. It wasn't hard to see the pattern. Robert Niro hadn't just made an offhand comment. He was riding the backlash, weaponizing it, fueling it, and Karoline had been his chosen target. It wasn't about war memorials. It was about her. While Martinez worked the legal side, Karoline's team quietly reached out to a tech analyst named Ethan Cole, a digital forensics expert. who'd worked with MAGA campaigns and was known for turning social media chaos into courtroom clarity. Cole began scraping millions of posts, identifying patterns, spikes, and influence flows that followed Niro's attacks. Within days, he found something shocking: a 740% spike in targeted harassment against Karoline within 48 hours of Niro's speech, with keywords and phrases echoing his exact wording: flag girl, camera patriot, fake, loyalty. This wasn't coincidence. It was cause and effect. And now it was all being documented. While all of this brewed in silence, Karoline remained publicly invisible. Every morning she attended briefings, handled her White House duties, smiled calmly at press corps questions that never once mentioned Niro. It drove the media crazy. Why isn't she responding, they kept asking. The answer, of course, was that she was responding, just not to them. But whispers began to spread inside Washington. Someone from CBS had been asked to release raw footage from the gala. A well-known law firm in New York had received a quiet but firm letter from Martinez requesting access to unaired podcast recordings. Something was coming. The silence wasn't weakness. It was legal precision. Then came the leak. A reporter from the Federal Times got hold of a rumor Karoline Leavitt was preparing a defamation lawsuit. A big one. And not just against Robert Niro, but against CBS, his management team, and the media outlets that had amplified a smear campaign against a federal official. The potential damages north of $100 million. Suddenly the tone shifted. Overnight, Niro's supporters weren't quite so loud. Sponsors began asking questions. Studios grew hesitant. A director rumored to cast Niro in an upcoming film quietly paused the contract. Meanwhile, Karoline remained silent. No victory laps, no gloating tweets, just that one sentence: loyalty doesn't need to shout. It was still pinned to her profile. But inside the West Wing, Martinez closed the final draft of a 62-page legal complaint, ready for filing in federal court. It detailed the defamation, the intent, the fallout, and the damage to Karoline's professional standing. And with it came an appendix: social media data, media transcripts, email trails, and the internal memo leaked from Niro's manager. She's the perfect target, young, vulnerable MAGA. Going after her will make headlines. The plan wasn't just to fight. It was to win, decisively, publicly, and permanently. And so while America argued on television and comment sections, boiled over, the woman at the center of the firestorm sharpened her blade in silence. She hadn't disappeared. She was preparing to strike. By the time Karoline Leavitt's legal team shifted into high gear, it was no longer just about a personal insult. It was about a cultural assault. What started as a demeaning line at a Hollywood gala had evolved into something far more deliberate, far more coordinated, and far more dangerous than anyone had realized. It wasn't just a comment. It was a campaign. Inside a secure conference room just blocks from the Capitol, Sylvia Martinez, battle-tested and razor-sharp, spread out a war room of evidence. It wasn't pretty. On the main screen was the now infamous clip of Robert Niro smirking in a tuxedo under chandelier lights, sneering at war memorials and mocking Karoline by name. "These flag girls don't know sacrifice," he had said, to the delight of the elite audience. Martinez watched it again, this time not as a lawyer but as an American. "Play it one more time," she told her assistant. "Now slow it down." Freeze on his face. Right there, he knew what he was doing. But that was just the beginning. Ethan Cole, the data analyst who had once unraveled disinformation campaigns in swing states, had now turned his algorithms loose on Niro's online footprint, and what he found shocked even the most seasoned staff. In the 72 hours following Niro's statement, over 47,000 posts flooded X, formerly Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok, targeting Karoline by name. The insults were relentless: Barbie patriot, Trump's cheerleader, fake loyalty wrapped in a flag. most traced directly back to phrases Niro had used in his media appearances. This was no spontaneous backlash. It was a coordinated echo chamber, and the damage was measurable. Martinez printed the most egregious ones and dropped them onto the table. This, she said, is defamation by amplification. But the final nail, the piece that shifted the case from hard to bulletproof, came from inside Niro's own camp. A leaked internal email quietly passed to Martinez by a disgruntled assistant within Niro's publicity firm blew the lid off the operation. Sent just 24 hours before the gala, the message came from Niro's longtime manager, Greg Palmer. It read blunt and cold. Karoline is the perfect target, young, visible, and lacks backing. Going after her gets headlines. She's soft. Hit her. One line in particular had Martinez's legal team frozen in silence. This is our shot to make Bob relevant again. Suddenly everything made sense. The timing, the tone, the repeated TV appearances. Niro hadn't just made an unfortunate remark. He had followed a plan, a targeted reputational takedown of a federal official designed to damage her credibility and boost his fading public profile. Karoline sat at the end of the table, her hands folded, eyes locked on the printout of that email. She didn't flinch. She just whispered, "They thought I'd fold." Martinez replied, "Now we show them you don't." With the video clips cataloged, the social media data mapped, and the damning email authenticated, the legal case took shape rapidly. The lawsuit wasn't just about Karoline's personal defamation anymore, it was about the weaponization of fame against public service. A narrative began to form, a Hollywood star using his platform to smear a young conservative woman who had done nothing but serve her country with quiet dignity. And now they had the receipts. Martinez drafted the complaint with precision, a 62-page document outlining how Niro's remarks had not only defamed Karoline, but incited coordinated harassment, career damage, and political sabotage. Attached were screenshots of speaking engagements canceled within days of Niro's media tour. Contracts paused. Interviews dropped. Media producers citing optics. Even federal communications logs showed a measurable dip in her press briefing invitations across mainstream networks after Niro's comments, and more than reputation was at stake. As a federal employee, Leavitt's professional integrity was tied to public trust. Martinez made the point clearly. When a celebrity undermines that trust without proof, it isn't free speech, it's targeted harm. The case was airtight, the timing was perfect, and the political winds were shifting. Veterans groups issued open letters of support. Legal scholars began debating the boundaries of influence and responsibility. Even some liberal commentators began to hesitate, noting that Niro's approach had become deeply personal and problematic. As Sylvia Martinez sealed the legal folder preparing to file in federal court, she looked across the table at Karoline and said, "You don't just have a case, you have a precedent." Karoline nodded once, firm and composed. "Let's make it count. Not just for me. For every person they think is too young, too polite, or too small to matter." What had begun as a celebrity's smug insult now stood poised to become a legal showdown with national consequences. The next time Niro saw her, it wouldn't be across a TV screen or on a talk show stage. It would be across the courtroom aisle. By the time the trial began, America had already taken sides. It wasn't just Karoline Leavitt versus Robert Niro, it was honor versus ego, service versus spotlight. And now the stakes would no longer be decided on social media or evening news panels. They would be judged under oath, under law, in a federal courtroom, packed tighter than a State of the Union gallery. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the press circled the courthouse like vultures. Inside, the mood was electric, tense, historical, charged with something bigger than celebrity or politics. Rows of veterans sat shoulder to shoulder, dressed in faded service caps and pressed uniforms. Behind them, law clerks, political aides, reporters from every network. The room wasn't just full. It was watching for a reckoning. At the plaintiff's table sat Karoline, composed, her hands folded in front of her, flanked by attorney Sylvia Martinez, the architect of this legal counterstrike. Across the aisle, Robert Niro sat in a tailored gray suit, posture, confident smirk barely concealed. Next to him, his lead attorney, Victor Russo, a flashy defender known for protecting celebrities from scandals but not necessarily from truth. The judge, Margaret Ellis, a respected federal jurist in her 70s with silver hair and a voice like polished steel, opened the proceedings. This court is convened to hear the case of Leavitt vs. Niro. The plaintiff may proceed. Martinez stood slowly. No theatrics, no raised voice, just a piercing calm. "Your Honor," she began, "this is not a case about opinions." Mr. Niro did not merely express disagreement. He executed a strategic media campaign to discredit a federal official to damage her career. And in doing so, he insulted the memory of millions who served this country in uniform. She let that line breathe. No one moved. The law does not protect deliberate harm, masquerading as commentary. Niro rolled his eyes, prompting a nudge from Russo, but he couldn't resist. When Russo rose to respond, Niro leaned slightly forward, as if speaking through his counsel. "Your Honor," Russo said, "this is a politically motivated stunt. Mr. Niro is a citizen of the United States. He holds strong views about militarism and political theater, and he exercised his First Amendment right to express them. He never incited violence. He never named anyone outside of a public context. What he said was opinion, and opinion is not a crime." But Judge Ellis wasn't interested in posturing. "Mr. Russo, free speech is not absolute if malicious intent can be proven. That is the question this court will decide." The next 2 hours were a masterclass in courtroom contrast. Martinez moved with quiet confidence, presenting email chains, video excerpts, and social media patterns that formed a picture of targeted defamation. The jury saw the now infamous clip of Niro at the Liberty Gala broadcast on a projector. These war statues are violence worship. Girls like Karoline waving flags for cameras don't understand sacrifice. Then came the podcast clip, Niro doubling down. She's not public service, she's public relations, a mascot with makeup. And then the moment that shifted the room. Martinez introduced the leaked internal email from Niro's own manager, Greg Palmer, writing, "Karoline is the perfect target, young, visible, and isolated. Going after her helps Bob stay in headlines." The courtroom fell silent. A veteran in the back row muttered audibly, "They planned it." Judge Ellis asked for order, but the tone had already changed. This wasn't about careless words anymore. It was about calculated attack. Niro, now visibly sweating, whispered angrily to Russo. For the first time, the Hollywood legend didn't look untouchable. He looked caught. Martinez closed the day with surgical calm. "This isn't about disagreeing with Karoline Leavitt's politics. Disagree all you want. But when a powerful man uses media to destroy the name of a young civil servant and rallies public scorn against her for daring to honor our nation's dead, there is no amendment that shields him from consequence." The jury looked down, taking notes. The veterans looked up, finally seeing someone speak their language in a courtroom. And Karoline. She never raised her voice, never looked to the cameras. She sat still, listening, absorbing, letting the truth speak louder than her presence. As court recessed, reporters scrambled to file updates. Outside the building, MAGA supporters stood holding flags while protesters across the street waved signs defending Niro's right to speak. America was watching in split screen. But for those inside the courtroom, the divide was starting to close. Because something bigger than politics had just taken the floor. It wasn't red or blue. It wasn't Hollywood or MAGA. It was justice, finally putting on the robe. When court resumed the next morning, the tone had shifted. The tension was no longer hypothetical. It was judicial. Reporters filed in early. Veterans filled the back rows again, arms folded, eyes sharp. No one came for entertainment anymore. They came for the truth. And Sylvia Martinez was about to deliver it, one screen, one statement, one seismic moment at a time. Judge Margaret Ellis nodded for the plaintiff to proceed. Martinez walked to the center of the courtroom and said without preamble, "Your Honor, we will now present direct, irrefutable evidence that this was not just defamation, it was design." The lights dimmed. The projector hummed. A grainy clip loaded onto the large screen facing the jury. It wasn't a public video. It was recorded from inside a strategy meeting. Private, never meant to see daylight, leaked by a former employee from Robert Niro's inner circle. The room fell still as the sound played, Niro's voice clear, cocky, confident. "That girl, Karoline Leavitt. She's the mega face now. Young clean press loves her look. If I hit her, I rise again. I need the spotlight back." A veteran in the front row exhaled audibly. A juror's pen froze mid-note. Martinez turned, let the silence settle, then asked the court staff to pause the clip and freeze-frame Niro's smirking face. She turned to the jury and said, "This wasn't a misstep. It was a calculated attempt to destroy a public servant's name, because doing so made him relevant again." The defense team scrambled. Russo leaned into Niro, who now looked smaller in his seat, no longer the silver screen icon, but a man exposed. But Martinez wasn't finished. She introduced Ethan Cole, the digital forensics expert, who approached the stand in a gray blazer and quiet tone, carrying nothing but a flash drive and truth. He loaded a social graph onto the courtroom screen. Lines, spikes, percentages. But he kept it simple. In the 48 hours following Mr. Niro's televised remarks, negative online content mentioning Karoline Leavitt increased by 740%. He clicked once. The graph shifted. Over 80% of those posts, phrases like fake patriot, MAGA puppet, and flag Barbie, could be traced to his own words and interviews. We tracked the language patterns and timestamps. They match his media appearances almost exactly. Martinez asked one question. "So this wasn't random?" Ethan nodded once. It was a ripple effect. His voice created the wave. And the wave hit hard. Karoline's press bookings were canceled. Speaking engagements dropped. Headlines turned cruel. All because a man with a stage saw a young woman with integrity and chose to turn her into a target. Then came the emotional blow. Martinez introduced not data but letters. From a leather file, she unfolded 3 typed pages and read excerpts aloud. Words not from experts or analysts, but from Americans. The first came from a retired Army nurse in Missouri. "My husband's name is on a stone wall in Washington. I watched Karoline speak at that memorial last year. She spoke for us. And when he mocked her, he mocked the quiet pain we live with every day." The second from a Gold Star father in Texas. "I don't know Karoline, but she reminds me of my daughter. She's why I believe service still matters. Tell her she's not alone." And the third from a 12-year-old boy in Nebraska, handwritten in pencil. "My grandpa says you're brave. He says standing up for soldiers is more American than being famous." Martinez's voice never cracked. But some in the courtroom did. A woman in the gallery wiped a tear. One of the jurors leaned forward, face tight. Niro sat frozen. His expression unreadable. The image of him framed next to his own quote, "If I hit her, I rise again," still hung on the screen behind him. Martinez closed her presentation with a line that would later be quoted across the nation. "This case isn't about silencing an actor. It's about stopping a pattern where fame excuses cruelty and power mocks service." Karoline Leavitt didn't ask for a fight, but she chose to answer one with truth, not vengeance. She returned to her seat. Karoline never spoke. She didn't have to. Her silence had already said more than a dozen speeches could. This was her courtroom now, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. The judge recessed for the day. Reporters sprinted out with headlines half-written in their minds. Inside, veterans nodded to each other not in triumph, but in recognition. Something had shifted. This wasn't just a legal moment. It was a moral one. And across the country, in town halls, on front porches, at kitchen tables where old flags still hang and folded uniforms sit in boxes, Americans began to talk about something different. Not politics, not Hollywood, but honor. The air in the federal courtroom was so still, you could hear pens tapping. After 5 days of arguments, revelations, and silence that cut sharper than any cross-examination, Judge Margaret Ellis looked over her glasses with the weight of the Constitution behind her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. This court finds that Mr. Robert Niro and CBS did knowingly and willfully engage in a public campaign of defamation, she said, her voice firm and final. They are hereby ordered to pay $150 million in damages to Ms. Karoline Leavitt for reputational harm, career interference, and targeted malice. The room didn't explode. It inhaled. And then it exhaled in the form of a slow rising wave of applause, not from the press, not from political strategists, but from the back of the room, where they had been seated in quiet formation all week. The veterans. One by one they stood. Older men in faded jackets, women holding worn photographs, grandchildren who had sat silently beside them all trial long. They didn't cheer. They clapped a sound more solemn than celebration, more sacred than protest. They weren't applauding revenge. They were honoring justice long overdue. And Karoline, she didn't pump her fist. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse into her legal team's arms. She simply rose from her chair, gathered her folder, and turned toward the gallery. Her eyes found no camera. Her gaze found those who'd stood for her. She placed one hand over her chest and gave a slight, respectful nod. It wasn't triumph. It was acknowledgement. On the other side of the aisle, Robert Niro sat frozen, his face ashen, shoulders collapsed inward. The courtroom lights, once flattering, now revealed a man who had gambled his legacy for applause and lost it all in a single gavel drop. He didn't speak. He didn't stand. He didn't even look at Karoline. His attorney, Victor Russo, placed a hand on his back as if to steady him, but there was no stabilizing what had just collapsed. Not just a case. An entire illusion. For decades, Hollywood had been his stage, his shield, his echo chamber. But today, in a courtroom not built for spotlights, that shield cracked wide open. Outside, the verdict hit the media like a thunderclap. Networks cut in live. Headlines screamed, Niro to pay $150 million in landmark defamation case. Fox News called it a victory for decency. Even CNN, once sympathetic, acknowledged the evidence had painted a troubling portrait of targeted public harassment. And CBS. They issued a corporate statement within the hour. We respect the court's decision and will review our editorial standards moving forward. Translation. They knew they'd been caught. But the story wasn't about money. It was about meaning. For every veteran who had ever been mocked, for every public servant belittled, for every American who believed quiet dignity still had a place in public life, Karoline Leavitt had just delivered the most resounding response possible. Not with shouting, not with spin, but with law. And it reached far beyond the courtroom. In Kansas, a retired colonel called into a local radio show and said, "I haven't stood and saluted since my last deployment. But today, I stood in front of my TV." In Ohio, a Gold Star mom told her church group she didn't just win for herself. She won for all of us who thought no one was listening. Even in Hollywood, murmurs began to ripple. A screenwriter anonymously told Variety, "The game's changed. You can't just destroy someone with a microphone anymore and think there's no consequence." Karoline, meanwhile, refused all interviews that day. She exited the courthouse quietly, flanked by Sylvia Martinez, and her legal team declined a press statement and stepped into a black SUV without a single wave. No celebratory post, no tweet, just silence. But the silence said everything. Because it wasn't just a victory in court, it was a cultural shift. It was a line in the sand that said fame is not a license to bully, and patriotism is not a punchline. And that young woman they mocked, she had just made legal history. In the days that followed, law schools began citing Leavitt v. Niro in media ethics classes. News outlets revisited how they framed conservative voices. Even social media companies quietly reviewed platform abuse policies. Something had changed, not overnight, but unmistakably. Karoline Leavitt, at 27, hadn't just stood up to a Hollywood legend. She had held him accountable. And in doing so, she reminded an entire generation that the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs the courage to stand. The gavel had fallen. The courtroom had emptied. But across the country, the reverberation of Leavitt v. Niro had only begun. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was a moral one. The verdict wasn't just about defamation. It was about dignity, restored, defended, and made undeniable in front of a nation that had forgotten what quiet courage looked like. 3 days after the ruling, Karoline Leavitt stood alone at a granite war memorial in Arlington, Virginia. No cameras, no entourage, no sound but the rustle of the American flag in the autumn wind. She placed a single rose at the base of the monument, stepped back, and faced the modest crowd of veterans and families gathered nearby. Then, with a voice steady but soft, she said, "We don't need Hollywood to tell the story of sacrifice. We just need to remember. Nothing more. Nothing less." Those words would echo through church pulpits, VFW halls, state houses, and living rooms across the country. Because in the end, Karoline had spoken for those who had no press agents, no production deals, and no stage, just folded flags in wooden boxes, and silence that still rings in the hearts of their families. The media, once obsessed with celebrity soundbites, now turned to something new: the Leavitt effect. It began in local school districts where young history teachers started redesigning civics units around responsible speech and civic courage. It spread to town councils where resolutions were passed, declaring the third Monday in March as Silent Defenders Day. And then came the flood of invitations. Karoline was asked to speak not at political rallies, but at memorial dedications, veterans' homes, and high school assemblies. She never gave lengthy addresses. She never attacked Niro again. Her message was always the same: tell the truth, then stand by it, even if you have to stand alone. That truth struck deep with older Americans who had lived through war, through loss, through decades of watching integrity slowly replaced by noise. For them, Karoline wasn't a trend. She was a sign that not all was lost, that maybe, just maybe, the next generation had a few who understood what it cost to keep the country whole. And in that understanding came a monument. In a quiet park outside Des Moines, Iowa, built entirely with private donations, a small bronze statue was erected. It wasn't of Karoline. It wasn't even labeled by name. It depicted a young woman standing beside a folded flag, her head bowed, a press folder tucked under one arm. At its base, etched in plain serif type, were the words, "For the silent defenders of memory." No grand ceremony, no broadcast, just a legacy. Meanwhile, Niro faded not just from headlines but from credibility. Studios distanced themselves. A memoir deal evaporated. His publicist left the firm. And for the first time in decades, his name no longer drew applause but uneasy glances. He became a cautionary tale not about censorship, but about consequences. But this story never belonged to him. It belonged to everyone who's been told they're too quiet to matter, too young to push back, too respectful to resist. Karoline showed them otherwise. She proved that dignity isn't weakness and restraint doesn't mean retreat. She turned silence into strategy, and strategy into justice. For veterans, she became more than a name. She became a defender of memory, not just of wars fought overseas, but of values fought for at home. In a letter from a World War II veteran in Florida, she read, "Miss Leavitt, I didn't expect much from your generation. I thought we'd lost you to noise and spectacle. But you reminded me of someone I fought beside in 1945. He didn't talk much either, but when it mattered, he stood." Karoline kept that letter in her desk drawer, not for praise, but for grounding. Because the battle wasn't over. The Leavitt effect had just begun. Young Americans, many of whom had tuned out politics entirely, began to pay attention not to party lines, but to character. They saw that a woman in her 20s could stand before the machinery of fame, endure its assault, and still walk away intact, not by fighting louder, but by fighting smarter. It wasn't about going viral, it was about going forward. And in the final lines of her only op-ed after the trial, printed in the Wall Street Journal, Karoline wrote, "America doesn't need louder voices. It needs clearer ones. If the next generation wants to lead, we won't do it by shouting over each other. We'll do it by remembering who we are and standing for those who no longer can." That's how the story ended. Not with thunder, but with truth that refused to bend. And for millions of Americans, especially those who had been told their time had passed, it was the reminder they needed, that character still matters, and that courage doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a pink blazer and walks quietly out of a courtroom, having changed the country. In today's world of noise, instant opinions, and viral outrage, Karoline Leavitt's story reminds us of something timeless: quiet. Courage still wins. When faced with public attacks and media pressure, she didn't strike back with insults. She gathered the truth, held her ground, and let the facts speak louder than fame. For those of us who grew up in an era where character meant something, this is more than a courtroom drama. It's a call to return to what we know is right. Her story teaches us that dignity is not weakness, and that no one is too young or too outnumbered to defend what matters. Whether you're a veteran, a parent, or a lifelong believer in American values, the message is clear. Stand firm, speak wisely, and never underestimate the power of truth. If this message resonates with you, leave a comment below, sharing what honor means in your life. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that uplift, challenge, and remind us all of what's still worth standing for.